Hi, everybody. My name's Brad Brain, and I'm a software engineer with a company called Faith Comes by Hearing. And I want to share a little bit with you today about how we're using Couchbase in one of our new apps that goes all over the world into some of the really crazy backwoods kinds of places, and how we're managing data and how Couchbase is helping us. So we at Faith Comes by Hearing do audio recordings of minority languages. And so I want to talk just a little bit about how we use language and what the big deal is. So there are a lot more languages than most people think. If you had to take a guess, most people guess that there are a couple hundred, maybe 1,000. There are actually 7,000, over 7,000 living languages. But 85% of the world's population just speak the top 100. The rest of the world are divided into 7,000 other languages. And those 7,000 other languages are the languages that we as an organization work with. Now, those languages are not the languages that you typically would encounter in large cities and in some of the more developed parts of the world. So we do a lot of our work, what we call off-grid, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The other question that a lot of people ask is, why audio? Well, around the world, much of the world's population are actually considered oral learners. That means that either they don't have a written language or a written version of their language, or they can't read their language at a functional level. In fact, more than half of the world is considered an oral learner. And also, many other people who aren't from oral cultures still prefer to learn and communicate in oral manner. I'll use myself as an example. I'd much rather listen to a podcast than read an article. You may be the same. So audio has a really big impact for many parts of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with Couchbase. So we as an organization, as I mentioned, we just developed a new app. And what we do with this app is we create scripts. Then we record scripts in the field, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then we master the audio back at our corporate office, and then we distribute that audio all over the globe. Now, we have three main pieces that we have in our Couchbase ecosystem at the moment as related to this app. And I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing our data management, our data sharing, because we have some pretty unique opportunities and challenges as part of our use case. So when we talk about working in the field, what we're talking about are teams of a few people, usually 2 or 3, who are trained to do audio work specifically. And then these teams are often family members. And the reason for that is they're out in the field for quite a while. They also usually live on the same continent where they work. So we have teams all over the globe that do this audio recording work. Now, the projects that they're working on, as I mentioned, we're working in minority languages. So these aren't languages that are spoken in big cities. So if we want to find native speakers of the language, typically we have to go out into villages and off the beaten path, you might say. These projects typically take 6 or more weeks off-grid or on-site, whichever you prefer. And so that's actually one of the reasons that a lot of these teams are family members, because being away from family for 6 weeks at a time is actually kind of a tough thing. So when in doubt, take your family with you. And when we get to that village, we're looking for at least 11 native speakers who can also read their language if possible. So that can be more challenging than you might think. Some of our projects actually work with as many as 30 individuals, but we can do a project with a minimum of 11. Over the course of those 6 weeks, we actually generate more than 10,000 audio files in each one of these projects. And as I mentioned before, those audio files are generated off-grid, away from the internet. So we have some challenges on how to handle that. The other thing that we do with our audio, though, is we collaborate globally. Who needs access to all that audio? Well, we've got a ton of partners, more than 400 partners scattered all around the globe. And those partners are people who support those projects in the field, but they're also the same people who use the finished product. So they kind of help us on both ends, I guess you might say. But working off the grid or in the field is not all it's cracked up to be sometimes. There are challenges that you might not anticipate from dealing in a more corporate type environment. So one thing that we always have to do is you have to plan for extra travel time. In many of these areas, there's no real road, certainly not a paved road. And in many circumstances, roads are very seasonal. This is a picture from one of our teams in the field who was driving on a road that was not as accessible as it was said to be. Rains come, and if you've got a dirt road, it can be quite an adventure. The other thing that we have to plan for is redundancy. So when we send a team out in the field, we never know what kind of options or opportunities they're going to have in a local village. This is the village market from one of our projects in Cameroon. And as you can see, if something went wrong with your laptop, you're probably not going to find anything to help replace it while you're in the field. So we take at least one extra of everything. You got to be prepared. The other thing that we deal with is that most of our teams work in an environment where the internet just isn't available. So in this particular project from this photo, the village is on that little island there, and there is no internet that's available. We did try on a couple of occasions using a satellite internet kind of situation, but it really was not practical for many of our teams, and not to mention it was very dependent on the weather, and that caused us a lot of issues. The other thing just to note is, we're talking about 6 weeks here of the internet not being available and being off grid, so that's no small time. The other thing that we have to deal with sometimes is power can be a challenge. Many of our projects, reliable power is tough to find. This picture here is from one of our projects in Liberia, Africa. I circled the power pole there, and yes, it is leaning precariously. Because of power challenges, many of our teams actually just will either buy or take a generator with them, but that also comes with its own challenges, because if you're going to take a generator, you have to figure out how to keep it fueled for the project needs. So some of these teams are definitely working in some challenging environments. Because of those challenges that I mentioned there, we had to do some thinking outside the box. And the first thing that I want to talk about is how we managed our audio files. So the sync process for audio files, we really have two challenges that we're dealing with here. And we have a couple of solutions that we implemented to manage that. The first thing that we did is we chose to use inline attachments instead of dealing with loose files. So what that means is when an audio file is saved, we encode it and put it into the document itself. That lets us peer sync them much, much more easily. Now, a couple challenges that presents is the size. So we chose to use an OOG or Opus file format instead of WAV. Now, that lets us get a whole lot more bang for our buck as far as audio size. So what would be a gigantic WAV audio file, we trim down, or we basically trim the size. We don't actually trim it, but we minimize the size in the OOG format. The other thing that we do is we then take that much smaller file and we break it into little tiny chunks. Those little tiny chunks allow us to sync much more smoothly. And then on the other computer, we can reassemble it back into a file. So what you have here is a lot of really tiny documents with binary data inside them that sync easily and can go back and forth. So what does that gain us? Well, a couple of things. The first thing is a smoother sync process for our peer sync. And you might ask why we want to peer sync that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, redundancy is really, really important. We don't know if one of those computers that we send out into the field may die on us while we're doing our field work. So we want to make sure that any other computer that's working on the project has a full copy of all of the audio. The second reason is actually our recording team, they may both be working off of some of the same audio data. So we want to make sure it exists in both places. Now, when we tried to do it with files and bigger chunks, we ran into issues with sync not being particularly smooth. Sometimes it would hang a little bit, but we found that in breaking it down into small chunks, it worked really, really well for us. So the other thing that we kind of had to think about was how to manage data when one of your teams is off-grid. That presents some unique challenges, as we discovered very quickly. So we had some steps to take to reduce conflicts. Now, when we have an environment where in our corporate office, one of the teams is doing some work, as is shown in this example here, and then we have another team that's disconnected and they're out in the field for 6 or more weeks. They're doing other things. They're editing this same document, but different parts of it. Then that causes some really significant conflicts when that field team comes back online, if you will, and starts to sync all their data back up to the cloud. So we have a couple of steps that we're taking to reduce those challenges. The first one is we split documents that see heavy usage. So in this particular example, we took that project document that you saw, and we created a document that our corporate office would work with, and then a separate document that our field team would do their work in. And what we've done there is we have allowed the corporate office to make as many changes as they might need to make, the field team to make as many changes as they may need to make, and all of it won't conflict. Well, then the question is, how do you get all of that back when you need to retrieve something? So we kind of developed what we call a bottom-up link. So as you can see here, each of these documents have a parent ID, and that parent ID corresponds to the ID of the actual project document. That's kind of like a header or something that can keep it all organized. And what that allows us to do is query by that parent ID and easily locate any of the data that we need to. Now, a few other lessons that we've learned. The first one is that database sizes, they really matter in Couchbase Mobile especially. So if your database gets too big, you can get some pretty significant latency as far as accessing data or querying for data. It's pretty quick when they're small, and it degrades over time. So one of the ways that we are handling that is we're actually dividing the databases into smaller pieces. For example, we created one database that's specifically for our audio files. And that firstly keeps us organized, but also it allows any operations that don't need audio not to get slowed or hindered by having a whole bunch of audio files in the database. The other thing that we have discovered is that using purge liberally is a really good thing. So purge is a command in Couchbase Mobile that clears your local data but doesn't create tombstones that get synced back up. So that lets you clear everything off of the local machine, but leave everything that's already been uploaded to the server intact. That really helps us out a bunch. We have basically a purge operation that we can run in between each project. That helps us keep our database sizes reasonable for our teams as they're out in the field. And it also allows us to just keep everything neat and tidy. Another thing that we learned the value of is indexing carefully. So indexing is an art. That was the way it was described to us by a Couchbase staff person we were working with. Too many indexes can cause your operations to be slower. Too few indexes can cause you some problems as well. So you want to index really carefully. A few very high value indexes can make a huge difference. So from the example a few minutes ago, an index created on the parent ID field had a huge payoff for us. We were able to basically retrieve all those documents functionally instantaneously, and that really helped us out a bunch. So as we think about what comes next, we are taking what we've learned from our current app that we've programmed, and we're actually kicking it all up a notch. So we have this app that we've just finished, and we've started a new one, and we're going to build on what we have done previously. So right now we have 2 to 3 computers that are working on the same data, and that's via PeerSync on Couchbase Mobile. And what we are aiming for is to have quite a few more computers working on the same data at the same time. So 4 to 8 computers working on the same data. We have had to do some additional steps to manage conflicts, and we have a few different things that we're doing. The other thing that we learned is that with peer-to-peer sync, having a continuous sync is actually a huge battery drain on a lot of our devices. So we're actually creating a mechanism in our new app that will do periodic one-shot replications instead of ongoing continuous replication all the time. The desire is for a functional equivalent, but hopefully a little less battery time there. Right now in our current app, as I mentioned earlier, we're managing about 10,000 audio files. Well, in our new app, we're looking to manage quite a few more than that. So we're going to need to handle 3 to 5 times more audio in our upcoming app. So we're looking into ways that we can more easily manage that data. We need to cut it up a little bit more is one of the options that we're looking at, maybe even a couple different audio databases. We're still exploring some options there. The other possibility would be something that offloads some of that. Those are issues we haven't solved yet, but we are really excited about the opportunities that we have coming up. Thanks so much for joining me today as I shared a little bit about what we are doing right now in our new app and coming up in the app that's currently in development. If you have questions for me, I would love to answer those. You can email me at the email listed here. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about our organization and what we do, feel free to stop by at the website listed there. We also have available for play all of the languages that we've recorded at that website. So if you're curious, want to try them out, they are there to listen to. Thanks so much.